It is 25 December 1942, and there is no time for carols at Bowman Field, Kentucky. Snow lies thin across the runway apron as ground crews load stretchers, splints, and plasma bottles into the belly of a C-47 Skytrain. A dozen young women in Army uniform climb aboard, checking litter straps with the same brisk efficiency a mechanic might check a bolt. They are flight nurses, and this aircraft, groaning as its engines turn over in the cold, is about to carry them across an ocean to a war most of them have only read about. Within hours, they will be airborne for North Africa, into the Tunisian campaign, tasked with something the United States Army had insisted for over a decade could not and should not be done: flying wounded men out of danger before the danger had a chance to finish them. 12 years earlier, a woman not one of these nurses had ever met stood in the wreckage of an Ohio town and reached the same conclusion the Army was still refusing to accept. Her name was Loretta Schimler, and by the time the first of these transports lifted off the runway, she had spent more than a decade trying to convince anyone in uniform to listen to her. This is the story of how an idea the military dismissed, mocked, and quietly buried for years became one of the most effective medical innovations of the Second World War. Credited with saving thousands of lives it was never supposed to be trusted to save. To understand why this mattered, you first have to understand what happened to a wounded soldier before anyone thought seriously about getting him off the battlefield by air. For most of military history, the interval between being wounded and receiving proper surgical care was measured not in minutes, but in days. A man hit in the field during the First World War might wait hours simply to be found, longer still to be carried to a dressing station, and then face a journey by mule cart, lorry, rail wagon, or hospital ship that could stretch on for a week or more before he reached a surgeon capable of doing anything beyond stopping the bleeding. Infection did not wait for transport schedules. Shock did not pause while convoys queued at a rail junction. Military physicians of the interwar years had a grim shorthand for it: the golden hour after a serious wound, the period in which prompt treatment made the difference between survival and death, was routinely lost to nothing more dramatic than distance and poor roads. By the 1930s, medical planners understood the problem in theory. What they lacked was the will to solve it by air. Aviation itself was still young, unreliable, and, in the eyes of many senior officers, an unnecessary risk to lay over an already fragile casualty. Aircraft of the period were unpressurized, prone to mechanical failure, and vulnerable to weather that could ground them for days. Sending a badly wounded man aloft in one, the argument went, was as likely to kill him as save him. Sending a woman along to nurse him mid-flight in a combat zone struck many in the War Department as simply unthinkable. The American Red Cross took a dim view of the idea. The American Nurses Association was unconvinced, and the Army itself, when a civilian pilot from rural Ohio first proposed the concept in earnest, gave her the same answer it gave for the best part of a decade: no.
There was also a deeper institutional resistance at work, one that had less to do with aircraft and more with who was proposing to fly in them. Military nursing in the early 20th century occupied an uneasy position within the armed forces, respected for its necessity, but rarely trusted with independence or authority. Nurses served under military discipline without holding full military rank for much of this period, and the idea of placing them, unsupervised by a doctor, in sole charge of critically wounded men thousands of feet above a war zone asked the institution to extend a degree of trust it had never previously been willing to give. It was one thing to accept that nursing mattered. It was quite another to accept that a nurse, alone in a cramped fuselage with no surgeon within reach, might be the only thing standing between a wounded man and death for the length of an ocean crossing. Loretta Schimler was not a nurse by training, which made her persistence all the more improbable. Born in Fort Jennings, Ohio in 1900, she trained first as a stenographer before drifting, almost by accident, into aviation after watching a test flight in Dayton. She earned her pilot's license in 1929 and became the first woman in the United States to manage a municipal airport at Bucyrus, Ohio. It was in 1930, after witnessing the aftermath of a tornado that tore through her home state, that Schindler's attention turned from flying for its own sake to flying as a means of saving lives. She had watched injured survivors wait for transport that could not reach them fast enough over damaged roads, and she began to ask an obvious, but at the time radical question: why not fly them out instead? In 1933, she founded the Emergency Flight Corps, a small civilian organization built around the idea of aerial rescue. 3 years later, she reorganized it as the Aerial Nurse Corps of America, recruiting 78 nurses trained to work in the air rather than on the ground. The concept was straightforward in principle and audacious in practice. Registered nurses given specialized training in the particular demands of treating patients at altitude, ready to be flown wherever they were needed. Schindler pitched the idea to the Red Cross. She pitched it to the Army. She pitched it, by her own account, to anyone in Washington who would give her 10 minutes. For years, almost nobody did. The rejection was not merely bureaucratic inertia. It reflected a genuine skepticism that ran through military medicine at the time. Officers who had spent careers around field hospitals and hospital trains saw no reason to entrust casualty care to an unproven technology and an all-female corps with no formal military standing. Schindler's organization survived the 1930s on willpower and very little else, propped up by nurses who volunteered their time and by a founder unwilling to let the idea die quietly. In July 1942, writing directly to Brigadier General David N.W. Grant, the air surgeon for the Army Air Forces, she compared her long campaign to that of the aviation pioneer court-martialed for insisting, against the judgment of his superiors, that air power would change the shape of war. She was, she told him, becoming another Billy Mitchell. It was a pointed thing to write to a general, and it was not far from the truth. What changed the Army's mind was not persuasion so much as necessity. As American forces committed to fighting across two vast theaters, the old evacuation routes by lorry, rail, and ship began to strain under casualty numbers no one had planned for. The tyranny of distance in North Africa and the Pacific made the arguments against air evacuation look less like caution and more like a failure to adapt. In August 1942, Schindler served as technical advisor on a Columbia Pictures film called Parachute Nurse, a small sign that the idea was finally entering the public imagination. Then, on 30 November 1942, the Army Air Forces did something it had refused to do for a decade. It formally called for experienced registered nurses and airline stewardesses to train as flight nurses within the Army Nurse Corps, to be assigned to dedicated air evacuation units.
The training itself took shape at the newly established School of Air Evacuation at Bowman Field, Kentucky. Recruits, many of them ordinary hospital nurses with no aviation background whatsoever, learned to manage patients in the cramped, unpressurized cabin of a military transport aircraft, most commonly the twin-engined C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse the Army also used to drop paratroopers and haul cargo. Stretcher cases were stacked on tiered litter racks along the fuselage walls, sometimes 3 or 4 high, with barely enough headroom for a nurse to crouch beside a patient and check a dressing. There were no monitors, no ventilators, none of the equipment a modern flight paramedic would take for granted. A nurse had to judge shock, blood loss, and deterioration by eye, by pulse, by the color of a man's lips, while the aircraft pitched and dropped through unpressurized air at altitude. Training covered altitude physiology, in-flight hemorrhage control, how to manage patients prone to seizure or panic in a confined, deafening cabin where engine noise made ordinary conversation almost impossible, and how to keep a full litter of wounded men calm during a bombing run below. The physical demands were considerable and rarely appreciated by outsiders who imagined the job as a glorified passenger seat. An unpressurized C-47 climbing to clear mountain ranges or storm fronts could put real strain on wounded men already weakened by blood loss, and nurses had to recognize the early signs of oxygen deprivation in patients who could not always describe what they were feeling. Bleeding that looked stable on the ground could resume without warning once cabin pressure changed. A man who seemed merely dazed at takeoff might, an hour into the flight, be sliding into shock, and there was no one else aboard to catch it. Nurses learned to read a patient the way a mechanic learns to read an engine, by sound, by color, by the small signs that something was about to fail, because by the time a crisis became obvious, there was often nowhere to land and no surgeon within reach. Discipline mattered as much as medical knowledge. A nurse who panicked when an aircraft came under fire or who lost her composure at the sight of a cabin full of the badly wounded put every patient aboard at greater risk. And instructors at Bowman Field drilled a kind of calm that had to survive genuine danger, not merely simulated stress. Graduates of the school were assigned to newly formed medical air evacuation transport squadrons, units built specifically around the aircraft, the air crew, and the flight nurses who would work together as a single evacuation chain, stretching from a forward airstrip to a hospital far behind the lines. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The theory was tested for real barely a month after the November call for volunteers. On Christmas Day 1942, the 802nd Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron departed Bowman Field for North Africa to support the Tunisian campaign. Among the flight nurses aboard was Ellen Church, a name with an odd echo in aviation history. A decade earlier, Church had persuaded a reluctant Boeing Air Transport to let women serve as the very first airline stewardesses, on the understanding that a trained nurse aboard would reassure nervous passengers. Now, recovered from a serious car accident and commissioned as an Army lieutenant, she was doing something closer to what she had originally envisaged, nursing patients in the air rather than serving them coffee. Just over 3 weeks later, the 801st Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron left Bowman Field for the South Pacific, bound for the fighting still grinding on around Guadalcanal.
What these squadrons did in the field was unglamorous and exhausting. Nurses flew into forward airstrips, still within range of enemy guns, loaded wounded men straight from the front, and treated them in flight on the return leg, often with no doctor on board at all. Records from these early deployments are patchy and in places still restricted or simply lost, so precise figures for individual missions are hard to pin down. What survives is consistent testimony that casualties who reached a flight nurse's care within hours rather than days stood a markedly better chance of survival. Over the following 2 years, the program expanded rapidly across every theater in which American forces fought, moving tens of thousands of wounded men by air rather than by road, rail, or sea. Conditions in the Pacific were, by most surviving accounts, harsher than those in North Africa. Flight nurses assigned to units supporting the fighting around Guadalcanal operated from rough airstrips carved out of jungle, often within earshot of ongoing combat, loading men who had been wounded only hours before onto aircraft that then had to navigate weather systems few pilots had ever trained for. There was no guarantee of a smooth or even a safe flight. Engine failure, navigational error, and enemy aircraft all remained real hazards throughout the war. Nurses in these squadrons were, by any reasonable definition, combat personnel, even though the institution that had so recently resisted their existence was still working out precisely how to classify them. Germany never developed an equivalent program with anything like the same scale or organization. The Luftwaffe operated some ambulance aircraft, and improvised air evacuation occurred on the Eastern Front out of sheer necessity as German lines collapsed, but there was no dedicated, trained corps of flight nurses comparable to the American model, and no systematic doctrine built around it. British forces, meanwhile, relied more heavily on established hospital ships and trains, supplemented by RAF casualty evacuation flights that, while valuable, were never organized on the scale or with the specialized training regime the United States built at Bowman Field. It was the American program, born from a civilian pilot's rejected idea, that became the template others eventually studied and adapted. The concept did not disappear with victory in 1945. It became the direct ancestor of the helicopter medevac operations that later defined battlefield medicine in Korea and, more famously still, in Vietnam, where the image of a wounded soldier being lifted out by helicopter owes its existence, more than most people realize, to a decade of rejection endured by a woman from rural Ohio. The scale of what the flight nurse program achieved is difficult to state with total precision, and honest history has to admit that. Wartime records were incomplete, some remain classified or simply lost, and the chaos of frontline evacuation rarely left time for careful accounting. What historians agree on is that the program, considered experimental for most of the war, proved itself far beyond what its skeptics had predicted, and is credited with saving several thousand lives by reducing the time between wounding and treatment from days to hours. The nurses themselves paid a price for that success. Flight nursing carried the ordinary risks of frontline duty, compounded by the hazards of wartime aviation, and at least one American flight nurse became a prisoner of war after her aircraft came down behind enemy lines, the only woman held as a German prisoner of war during the conflict. By the war's end, the United States Army Nurse Corps as a whole had grown to more than 59,000 members, a figure almost unimaginable set against the tiny handful of nurses on active duty before Pearl Harbor. Flight nurses remained a small, specialized fraction of that number, but their statistical rarity belied their outsized influence on how military medicine would be organized for the rest of the century. What had begun as an unfunded civilian experiment run out of a small Ohio airport had, within a decade, become a formal component of Army doctrine, studied, expanded, and eventually exported to every theater the United States fought in.
Survivors of the program and the aircraft they flew in are not easy to find intact today. Most of the wartime C-47s used for evacuation duty were converted back to cargo or civilian transport work after 1945, and few retain their original medical fittings. Photographs, training manuals, and personal accounts from Bowman Field survive in American military archives and in smaller collections maintained by local historical societies, including the one in Schimmel's home county in Ohio, which continues to preserve what remains of her personal papers. Loretta Schimmel's own recognition came slowly, in the unhurried way institutions often repay the people who force them to change. She was finally commissioned into the Women's Army Corps in 1944, more than a decade after she first raised the idea, and served until her honorable discharge the following year. It was not until 1966, more than 2 decades after the war's end, that the Air Force formally recognized her as a pioneer of air evacuation and presented her with the gold wings of a flight nurse. She died in Glendale, California in 1981, and a new memorial headstone was placed at her grave in Bucyrus, Ohio in 2014, funded by local historians determined that her name should not simply fade. Her original organization, the Aerial Nurse Corps of America, never received the official backing she spent her life pursuing and disbanded once the war drew its members into formal military service. But its central idea survived her, absorbed into an institution that had spent a decade telling her it would never work. Return for a moment to that runway at Bowman Field on Christmas morning 1942. The nurses climbing aboard that C-47 were doing something the Army had insisted for more than 10 years was reckless, unnecessary, and beyond the proper role of women in uniform. They were doing it anyway, because the war had finally forced the institution to catch up with an idea it had ignored for a decade.
Every one of the thousands of wounded men who survived a flight home instead of a days-long convoy owed something to a rejection letter that never quite won. The Army had every reason, on paper, to say no. It said no for years, and when it finally said yes, it inherited a program built almost entirely on the persistence of people it had refused to listen to. There's a particular kind of vindication in military history that arrives too late to be satisfying and too complete to be denied. Loretta Schimmeler got hers in 1966 in the form of a small pair of gold wings pinned on more than 2 decades after the fact. The thousands of men who came home because a nurse was crouched beside their stretcher at 10,000 feet never knew her name. They didn't need to. The idea the Army ignored had already done its work.